What did he do to change things?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll be glad to do that. Baeck was as I said before, a liberal Jew. In fact, not only was he a liberal Jew, but he was the successor of Claude Montefiore as the president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism from 1938 until into almost the year of his death. But he was not a typical liberal Jew in terms of what liberal Judaism had been in the 19th century. So that one can call him a reformer of reform. But maybe I should make clear again that he was not a Reform Jew in Germany. Reform Judaism in Germany was limited to one radical congregation in Berlin called the Reformgemeinde. Baeck's liberal Judaism was more like somewhat in between American conservative Judaism and American Reform Judaism. Now, in the 19th century, Jewish reform was very much tied up with what was perhaps more than anything on the minds of Jews in Germany at that time, which was emancipation. It was important to create a Judaism that didn't stand out too much, that was a religious denomination, the way that Protestantism and Catholicism were religious denominations. It was trying to make sure that Judaism was up with the times, that it was, in the German word, zeitgemäß. It was up to date, as it were. It had also gotten the character of being quite bourgeois in character. Within Jewish communities, there was a division by parties. There was a liberal party, there was a Zionist party, there was an Orthodox party. But for Leo Baeck, it was the community as a whole that was important. And it was important for him that liberal Judaism cease being imitative, that rather liberal Judaism should begin more and more to become a criticism of the present for the sake of the morally better messianic future. So that he became a critic of the Reform movement. The Reform movement had also very much occupied itself with liturgical change. Should we take out Michaye HaMetim, revives the dead? Should we remove Return to Zion from the prayer book? What Leo Baeck argued was that the liturgy was not nearly as important as the manner in which the Jew prayed. It was not how we prayed, but that we prayed. And for him, the essence of prayer was not the literal words, but rather the way you approached prayer. He made a sharp distinction between prose and what he called poésie, a poetic approach. It was important for the Jew who prayed to move beyond the words to a direct relationship with the spirit of Judaism and with the God who was the God of the commandment to lead the moral life, to create the moral society. So Baeck's view of liberal Judaism was then not away from tradition, but rather toward a tradition that was critical of the present for the sake of the future. Now, there was also the question of how should the liberal Jew relate to ritual and to halakha, to Jewish practice. And here Baeck is separate from Orthodox, perhaps most clearly, because for him, ritual laws or commandments are not commandments in the same sense that moral commandments are. For Leo Baeck, the important commandment was Kedoshim to you. You shall be holy because I, God, am holy. And that holiness expressed itself in V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that you shall regard your fellow human being, so your mitmensch, your fellow human beings, as you regard those who are like you, or even you yourself. So that for Leo Baeck, there was the moral commandment. What then about ritual commandments? What then about Shabbat? What then about kashrut? For Baeck, even though he did not regard commandments like Shemor et Yom HaShabbat, honor the Sabbath day, keep the Sabbath day, or kashrut, he didn't regard them as commandments that were given in the same sense as the moral commandment, but they were commandments nonetheless, in the sense that the preservation of the observance of traditions helped to keep the Jewish community alive and able to perform its moral conduct, and he would say also mission in the world. So a Jew was called upon to keep Shabbat for his own religious exaltation, but also because the prayers of Shabbat reminded the individual Jew of his moral responsibilities. And the same thing for kashrut. Baeck, in fact, was an observant Jew. He walked to synagogue on Shabbat, and he kept kashrut, so that he recognized the importance of practice, but practice was for him, and in this respect, he was also liberal. One kept those practices which were meaningful to the individual. In that respect, he was a little bit like Franz Rosenzweig. One does those ritual commandments which one feels addressed to do. So this is Baeck with regard to the observance of rituals. And the fundamental commandment which one must obey, which he calls the gebot, the commandment to lead a moral life and to help to create a moral society. So that's, I think, the way that he understood liberal Judaism.
Yes, thank you for that. And thinking about what you said of his biography and now of his thought, one can see perhaps certain influences, the fact that he came from Poznan, that he studied in Breslau, and then he went to Berlin. He's responding to the many different kinds of influences in his life. His father, after all, was a rabbi, but also a fine scholar. I wonder if his commitment to Zionism, for instance, might be influenced by his experiences in Poznan, or perhaps you might explain some of the other influences that shaped his view of Zionism. I also think as he had just one child, a daughter, and I also am an only child and a daughter. And I think that she and I may have both influenced our fathers in their openness to women holding public office, as Baeck, of course, did, as you point out. And the question of his commitment to Judaism and the ethical, I wonder if we might try to understand that as a very special aspect of German Jewish thought. It's a very strong position that's taken. To some extent, it's a response to Kant's argument that Judaism is not a moral religion, that it's heteronymous. To what extent do you think Baeck is here responding to that problem that Kant posed, which had political implications. Can Jews be emancipated and given equality if their religion is not a moral religion? Is there an apologetic quality, in other words, to Baeck's arguments? So I wonder if you might say a couple of words about the different kinds of influences that shaped his thinking.
Well, I see three things there: Zionism, women, and apologetics. Let me take them perhaps in reverse order and start with apologetics. When Baeck wrote his first book, The Essence of Judaism, it was argued with some accuracy, I believe, that there was an element of apologetics in it, because Baeck's relation to scholarship was that it was not simply satisfying curiosity, but that Jewish scholarship had to have a significance for Jews in their lives today, in the present time. And consequently, when he wrote The Essence of Judaism, he was to a large extent talking about that within the Jewish tradition, which continues to be meaningful in the present, a usable past, it is sometimes called. He also believed that the kind of scholarship that was necessary was a committed scholarship, an engaged scholarship, a scholarship from the inside. He believed that in order to write at least a spiritual Jewish history, you had to be on the inside. You had to be someone who was committed to Judaism in a moral and spiritual sense. He was very much influenced in that regard by the German non-Jewish thinker Wilhelm Dilthey, because Dilthey had argued similarly that in order to understand the past, one had to really have an inner understanding. He used the word verstehen in German, and one also had to have something which Dilthey called Mitgefühl. You had to feel as a historian to a great extent what it was that the character felt about whom you were writing. So one can say that Baeck tried to write history from the inside out. Some historians would say, well, that goes against my positivist views. But for Baeck, that was very, very important. So he was influenced certainly by Kant, and despite the fact that Kant believed that Judaism was legalistic, that it was did not give the individual full autonomy. And in that respect, Baeck certainly disagreed with Kant. But as mediated by Hermann Cohen, Baeck was very much influenced by the tradition that Judaism, as Cohen put it, was at its heart an ethics of society, of a society which strives for a messianic ideal. Baeck liked to quote a saying which is often quoted today, "Litakein olam b'malchut Shaddai," to fix the world as it should be in view of God's commandment of they shall beat their spears and their
spears into plowshares. Yes,
thank you.
I'm sure that kind of ideal was also influencing his Zionism.
Yes, and I will come to the Zionism, and then I will come to the women as well. When Baeck was young, there was the big discussion about the First Zionist Congress of 1897. And German Jewish leaders, including most rabbis, including Orthodox rabbis, opposed Herzl's scheme. And yet Baeck would not go along with the majority. He would not condemn Zionism, though he himself initially, like most German Jews, was not a Zionist. But already before the Hitler period, he became very much involved with the Palestine Project. He became a member of the Jewish Agency. He was a leading member of the Pro-Palestine Committee. He didn't join the Zionist organization in Germany because he was really more of a cultural Zionist than a political Zionist at that time. The fact that he wasn't committed to the one or the other, the pro-Zionist or the anti-Zionist, made him a far more acceptable candidate to become the leader of the united Jewish community. It is also true that, like German Jews, he believed for a long time that Germany was Heimat, that Germany was home. He had been a patriot in World War I of the German cause. But then, in the course of the 1930s, he recognized more and more how important it was for the Jews to have a Heimat of their own homeland in Palestine. He visited Palestine in 1935, particularly visiting Jews from Germany who had already made Aliyah to Palestine at that time. And he believed that the state of Israel played a central role in Jewish history, a spiritual role as well as a political role. He, like other German Zionists, was very much on the liberal side. He wanted to have a state that was really fair to Muslim inhabitants as well as Jewish inhabitants of the state. And he believed in the importance of democracy and the lack of any kind of kfiyah datit, any kind of coercion of a religious nature. The kind of state, perhaps, that Herzl envisioned in his novel Alt Neuland, in which all of the inhabitants feel that it is their home, whether Jew or non-Jew. He, at the time that the state was established and the War of Independence was occurring, he, together with associates in England, established a fund that would try to allay suffering on both sides of the war that was going on for Israel's independence. He also believed that the liberal Judaism should have its center in Eretz Yisrael, in the state of Israel thereafter, and that the World Union for Progressive Judaism should be centered there, something which didn't happen until 2 decades after Leo Baeck passed away. So for him, Zion was tremendously important, which is not to say that he neglected the diaspora. He believed, like the Jewish philosopher Shimon Rabadovich, that Jewish life internationally should be understood as an ellipse with 2 foci, the one focus being Eretz Yisrael and the other being the diaspora, in particular American Jewry, and that these 2 could in fact be complementary to each other. The Jewish community of Israel would stress the particular aspect of Judaism, and the diaspora would stress the universal aspect of Judaism. So Zionism, to sum up, became more and more important for Leo Baeck in the years during which the Jews were ever more persecuted. But he certainly saw it very early, as did Ahad Ha'am, as a spiritual center, and continued to believe that throughout his life. Visited Israel on a number of occasions, became very close friend of Gershom Scholem, celebrated Passover in Scholem's house on one occasion. Finally, the third part of your question, Susannah, with regard to his wife, Baeck was very, very reluctant to speak about his personal life, which made...
My question was about his consideration of women holding public office in Judaism, and whether having an only child be a daughter, not a son, might have influenced him.
Yes, like it may have influenced your father. But let me say this. Leo Baeck wanted to have more children. Unfortunately, his wife had a miscarriage, and after that, they were not able to have more than the one child. His daughter, unlike his wife, went to university, got a university education, and Leo Baeck believed very strongly that women should play an important role in Jewish life, in public life. He, on a number of occasions, praised the Jewish Women's Organization in Germany. Bertha Pappenheim was mentioned by him on a number of occasions, she being the founder of that organization. He was very close to Hannah Karminski, who worked with him during the Nazi years and was responsible for social welfare work. He was, however, in some respects, one would have to say, old school, in that he took him a while to get used to the idea that possibly men and women could sit together in a synagogue instead of separately. Men and women sitting separately was, in fact, the pattern in liberal Judaism until the Nazi period, until the last synagogue in the Prinzregentenstrasse in Berlin was built, where men and women could sit together. And when Leo Baeck was asked about whether men and women should sit together or separately, he didn't want to offend either group and suggested there should be a section where men and women could sit together and another section where those who were uncomfortable with that could sit separately. And as I note in the book, he himself, on a rare occasion that he talked about his personal life, said that after his wife died in 1930, or just before his wife died in 1937, when she was already very sick, he appreciated the fact that he could sit with her when he and she were attending services together, and he was not himself functioning from the pulpit at that time. So he certainly believed in different roles for women. He certainly believed in a public role for women, but he saw this as something that was gradually developing, and he encouraged it. Yes.
Well, yes, I want to move to the Nazi years. But just quickly, Regina Jonas was a woman studying at the Hochschule, the liberal rabbinical seminary in Berlin, in the early 30s. And I imagine he had at least met her. Do we have any idea if he supported the ordination of women? She had wanted to be ordained, but in the end was ordained privately in Frankfurt by Isaac Dienemann in 1935.
Yes.
Do we know anything? Did he express a view about her and her candidacy?
There's very little, but there's one case in which he calls her his colleague. So I think that he did perhaps slowly come to recognize that the rabbinical role, no less than the social welfare role or other roles that Jewish women could play in society, that the rabbinical role as well was a possibility and a desirable possibility for women. And perhaps that was, in fact, because his only child was his daughter. Let me just say one other thing. There was a tradition of rabbis in Leo Baeck's family, and his grandson married a woman who became a rabbi, so that the tradition of rabbis in his family was carried on by Rabbi Ellen Dreyfus, who married Leo Baeck's grandson, great-grandson.
And I do want us to go on to the Second World War, to the Nazi period. At this point, when the war began, Leo Baeck's daughter had already married and moved to England. His wife had died, so he was very much alone. But he had the opportunity to leave Germany, but he remained adamantly. And I wonder if you might tell us a bit about Leo Baeck in those years, those terrible years, as a political representative of the Jewish people in Germany, and then at Theresienstadt as a spiritual guide and sustainer of the Jews who were imprisoned there.
Yes, the Nazis made every effort to try to make the Jews of Germany fit the stereotype that they had of them. Groveling, without dignity, nasty, ugly. What Leo Baeck was able to do through his work in Germany was to uphold morale, to enable the Jews to feel that they were in fact not what the Nazis described them as being. He did this most notably in a message that he wrote for Shabbat, that he wrote for Yom Kippur, actually a prayer in the year 1935, in which he pointed out again and again, we Jews stand before our God. God is our judge, not the Nazi propaganda. We gave the world a moral message for all humanity. We have a reason to be proud of our tradition. And later at Theresienstadt, where Jews were each given a number, Baeck himself was given a number. He tried to convince, to urge the Jews to think of themselves in terms of what they were in the past and what they will be in the future. He tried to maintain their self-esteem, their dignity, their self-regard through encouragements of various kinds, spiritual encouragement and also intellectual encouragement. In Theresienstadt, he and others, including Regina Jonas, gave lectures on Judaism and on general philosophy, held late at night in the cold attic of one of the barracks. Leo Baeck spoke about Moses Maimonides, and he spoke about Plato, and he spoke about Jewish history. So that he was not simply an organizer. In fact, most of the organizational work was done by his fellow worker in the Reichsvertretung, Otto Hirsch, but he was the one who saw it as his principal task, one that he couldn't delegate to anyone else, to enable Jews to believe in themselves and to believe in the future, to counteract the vicious Nazi propaganda. So one really has to say that he played not just the role of the leader in organizational terms or the representative to the Nazis, but very much the role of the Roetzon, or as we would say in English, the pastor, collectively for the Jewish community. And he made the decision to remain in Germany, which involved a certain amount of courage. But as he put it in some of his writings, after all, in Judaism, we have a tradition of Kiddush Hashem. And if our consciences require of it, if our faith in God requires it, then we have to be ready to make that ultimate sacrifice, even at the cost of our lives. There was a tradition in Leo Baeck's family that during the Middle Ages, some of the members of the family had in fact become martyrs, Mekadshe Hashem. And Leo Baeck was ready for that. He also greatly admired the prophets. The Essence of Judaism book is largely about the prophets, because the prophets had courage. The prophets spoke their minds. The prophets were not compromisers. The prophets did not believe in escaping from the word of God as they understood it. And Baeck thought he could do no less. He had been cast into the position of leadership, and that leadership demanded that he exercise the duties that were required of him as he understood it, required by God.
Yes, he was an extraordinary figure in those terrible times. Would you like to say another word about the period of time before he was deported to Theresienstadt and had to report to Nazi officials? He was at one point, you write, asked to write a book manuscript for the Gestapo. Do you want to say a word about that?
Well, let me only say that Baeck himself surprised the Nazis in some respects. They expected him to come crawling to them whenever they made some decision. And he refused to. His bearing, his Haltung, his composure, just astonished them. This was not what they thought Jews were like. Yes. He stood straight, erect before them. And there's one incident that I think reflects it correctly. Late in that period, the Jews were expected to turn in their radios. And they were given a particular day to turn in their radios, and the Nazis, in their nasty fashion, that date was Yom Kippur. And when Baeck didn't show up at the police station with his radio, one of the policemen said, "You see, I told you, Leo Baeck is not going to violate his holiday because of a command that we have given to him." So he was imprisoned 5 times, and on various occasions, it was thought that they would execute him as they executed some of his associates, even before Theresienstadt. But perhaps because he had support from the outside, and until the war, there was also concern about the reporters from Great Britain or from America who were there, and Baeck's name was known to them. So that was also, I think, a factor. But as time went on, and particularly after his wife passed away, it became very, very lonely in Berlin. And yet it was important for him, even at that time, to keep up Jewish scholarship, because learning for Baeck, as for a traditional Jew, is essential to the Jewish religion. And therefore, he was pleased when he was able to put together the last volume of the Monatsschrift für Geschichte und Wissenschaft des Judentums, the flagship of German Jewish scholarship, only to have it be confiscated by the Nazis. But for Baeck, learning was essential. Ernst Simon recalled how in the morning Baeck would first of all daven, he would pray in the morning like any traditional Jew. Then he would study a Blatt Gemara, he would study some of the Talmud, then he would study a Greek play in the original Greek, and then he would put together what he had to do in terms of his activity during that day. This is the importance of scholarship for Baeck. And here I want to say that Baeck always tried to combine Midrash and Maaseh. That is to say, he taught, by the way, Midrash at the Hochschule. And if we take Midrash in the broadest sense of meaning learning, ideas, interpretation, for him, that was the beginning that led to the Maaseh, to the action that was incumbent upon him because his conscience demanded it. So these are some of the different aspects of Baeck's life and action during those very difficult, I call them troubled years of Jewish leadership in the 1930s and in Theresienstadt in the period that he was there.
Thank you. I would say he exemplifies the greatness of the German Jewish tradition. And you make that very clear in your book, a person of deep learning and a person of great dignity. And that certainly continues to this day, his heritage. I'll just mention that a friend of mine who was raised Mennonite read The Essence of Judaism, the 1922 version, which I understand in Germany was a very popular bar mitzvah gift in those days. But she read the book as a student in Canada and was tempted to convert to Judaism. She was so inspired by Leo Baeck, and that was just some few years ago. I recently read an article on the history of scholarship on the Pharisees, and Leo Baeck is discussed for many pages, his work on the Pharisees. So his scholarship also receives the kind of credit that it deserves. I think it has a legacy for us today, and perhaps as a final word, you might speak to that, how Leo Baeck serves as a model, as a Jew, as a human being.
Yes, I think he very much does serve as a model. And I would say that I like to apply to him a Hebrew expression, toho kavaro. That is to say, he was someone who practiced what he preached. There was no difference between the thought and the action in so many prominent individuals, be they artists, be they political figures, be they philosophers. Their thought, as important as it may be, is often contradicted by the way they lead their lives. But that was not true for Baeck. There was a congruity between his belief and his actions. He also was very much opposed to personality cults, of which we see so many today on the part of political leaders. He preferred not to use the word I in his sermons, for example. He believed the important thing was the message of Judaism and not the individual who is stating it. That put him at odds with some of the younger rabbis who like to talk about themselves, and a lot of rabbis I know today who like to talk about themselves from the pulpit, whether it be in America or elsewhere. Baeck was a man of humility. That I think we also can learn from him, something very important to remember today. And finally, let me say this. Baeck stressed, on the one hand, the individual and the importance of the individual, and on the other, the collectivity, humanity. He was far more critical of intermediate entities like the state. Much of his writing was a critique of the state when it went astray, as it did during the Nazi period. He thought that the Jews should be a conscience for humanity. And you mentioned conversion. After the Holocaust in particular, Baeck believed that the numbers had to be restored, that if you really had pride in your Judaism, then you would be ready to give its message to others. And so he went so far as to desire that Jews restore an ancient tradition of seeking converts to Judaism, so that the 6 million that were lost could be at least somewhat restored. With regard to the Holocaust itself, Leo Baeck, I think, took a position which is based upon the biblical book of Job. We really cannot know what God's will is, or nature is, let me put it that way. God's nature is we can only know the commandment that issues from God. And therefore, in his later writings, he particularly spoke of not only Gebot, but also of Geheimnis. In other words, the essence of God is mysterious, but the command to do justly is something we as Jews need to heed. That, I think, is certainly a message for our time.
Thank you so much, Michael Meyer. This is a wonderful book, and it's been a wonderful conversation with you. I appreciate it. Leo Baeck remains a very inspiring figure. I understand we have a question from the audience, and I'll ask Irina to...
Yes. So Sharon is asking, when Baeck came back to Germany after the war, and how he related to the new Jewish community, Jews living in Germany being so different from who has been there before the Holocaust.
Yes, that's a very important question. I'm grateful for that question. The fact is, his attitude changed. Initially, when he came to the United States on one of his trips to America and was asked about it, he said that the soil is poisoned. There should not be a Jewish community in Germany anymore at all. And that the German people was responsible for what happened, and maybe a generation that was still very young might be able to change. But for the present, Jews really should have nothing to do with this new Germany. But that attitude changed for a number of reasons. One, because the German government decided to give reparations to individuals and to the state. He also established a close relationship with the first president of the Federal Republic, with Höss, and also with certain of the clergy over there. Furthermore, as far as the Jewish community was concerned, when some of his students became rabbis in Germany after the war, like Nathan Peter Levinson, for example, he saw that there was a Jewish community coming into existence, and he felt it was his responsibility, as having been a German Jew himself, to help that community. So he answers halachic questions for some of the rabbis who have become leaders of the German Jewish community in the Federal Republic. So initially very negative, He made a statement which some thought he had made already earlier, that the 1,000-year history of German Jewry was at an end. We know he definitely said that after the war, may have said it earlier, but that attitude changed. He believed that there was a possibility for a productive German Jewish community, and that as long as the leadership of the state consisted of people who were anti-Nazi, then there's room for it. What he was upset about was the fact that some of the intellectual leaders hadn't learned their lesson. He was very much upset that the historian Meinecke, writing about the catastrophe, didn't talk about or express any regret about what had happened to the Jews when he wrote about that period, which is another lesson we can learn from Leo Baeck, and that is that even a highly intellectual society with an intellectual elite nonetheless can be easily seduced by a propaganda machine.
Thank you. I don't know if we have received additional questions from the audience.
No, there was nothing else.
Well, in that case, I want to thank you very much, Professor Michael Meyer, for a wonderful discussion about a very important figure who does have much to offer us to this day of spiritual sustenance and intellectual vitality. And I thank you for your time today, and I thank you for your excellent biography, one of your many excellent books and articles that I encourage everyone to read. And I thank the Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem and around the world. Irina, thank you so much for hosting us, and I look forward to future occasions to get together. Thank you.
And my thanks to you, Professor Heschel, for joining me in this discussion.
Thanks to both of you and also for the audience. And I apologize again for the technical problems. And yeah, I hope we see you soon at another event. Take care. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.